The story begins in the early 1960s, at a time when Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary stood as America's most formidable prison, perched on a rocky island in the middle of San Francisco Bay. The prison had earned a fearsome reputation, housing some of the country's most dangerous and cunning criminals. Among the gray concrete walls and the constant sound of waves crashing against the rocks, three men were quietly plotting what would become the most famous prison escape in American history. Frank Lee Morris arrived at Alcatraz in January 1960. He was a different breed of criminal, not particularly violent, but exceptionally intelligent. Born in Washington, D.C. in 1926, Morris had lived a troubled life from the very beginning. Orphaned at a young age, he spent his childhood bouncing between foster homes, never finding stability or a sense of belonging. By the age of 13, he had already committed his first crime, and from that point forward, his life became a revolving door of correctional facilities and prisons. But Morris was no ordinary criminal. He possessed an IQ of 133, placing him in the superior intelligence category, and he had an uncanny ability to escape from institutions. Before arriving at Alcatraz, he had successfully escaped from several other prisons, earning him a reputation that preceded his arrival on the island. The Anglin brothers, John and Clarence, came from a completely different background, but shared Morris's determination and resourcefulness. They were born into a large family of 13 children in Donaldsonville, Georgia, during the Great Depression. Their family eventually moved to Ruskin, Florida, where they grew up working alongside their parents and siblings as seasonal farmers, following the harvest from Florida to Michigan and back again. The Anglin brothers were exceptionally close, inseparable really, and from a young age they learned to swim in the lakes and rivers near their homes. This skill would prove crucial to their escape plan years later. The Anglin brothers turned to crime in the 1950s, initially committing small burglaries. Their specialty became robbing banks, and they worked together with remarkable coordination. In 1956, they attempted to rob the Bank of Columbia in Alabama, but the heist went wrong, and they were captured. Both brothers were sentenced to 15 to 20 years in prison, and were initially sent to the Florida State Prison. Like Morris, the Anglin brothers proved to be persistent escape artists. They made several escape attempts from various prisons, and their determination to break free eventually led authorities to transfer them to the one place designed to be inescapable: Alcatraz.
John Anglin arrived at Alcatraz in October 1960, and Clarence followed in January 1961. By this time, Frank Morris had already been on the island for over a year, carefully observing the prison's routines, studying the guards' patterns, and mentally cataloging every detail of the facility's structure. The three men were assigned to cells in Cell Block B, positioned relatively close to one another. This proximity would prove essential to their plans. Morris was in Cell B-138, John Anglin in B-140, and Clarence Anglin in B-150. A fourth man, Alan West, who occupied Cell B-146, would also become involved in the escape plot, though fate would deal him a different hand on the night of the actual escape. The men didn't immediately begin planning their escape. They first needed to build trust with one another, to ensure that each man had the commitment and nerve required for such an audacious undertaking. They also needed to thoroughly understand the prison's layout, its vulnerabilities, and the challenges they would face. Alcatraz was designed with escape in mind, meaning it was designed to prevent it. The prison sat on an island surrounded by the freezing waters of San Francisco Bay, with currents so strong and unpredictable that they could pull even the strongest swimmer under. The water temperature rarely rose above 55 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to induce hypothermia within minutes. The prison administrators often told inmates that even if they managed to escape from their cells and get off the island, the bay itself would become their prison and ultimately their grave. But Morris and the Anglins were not deterred by these warnings. They began their planning sometime in late 1961, nearly a year before the actual escape. The first challenge was the most immediate one: how to get out of their cells. Each cell was small, measuring about 5 feet by 9 feet, with a barred door at the front and concrete walls on 3 sides. The back wall of each cell, however, had a ventilation grate, approximately 6 inches by 9 inches, that led to an unguarded utility corridor behind the cells. This corridor ran the length of the cell block and was used by maintenance workers to access the prison's plumbing and electrical systems. The ventilation grates were secured with concrete, but the concrete around them had been damaged by moisture and salt air over the years, making it softer and more brittle than it should have been. This was the weakness Morris identified, the crack in Alcatraz's armor. The men needed tools to exploit this weakness, and they needed to acquire them without arousing suspicion. Morris, with his superior intelligence and years of experience manipulating prison systems, took the lead in this regard. The inmates at Alcatraz were allowed certain privileges, including the ability to work various jobs within the prison and to participate in recreational activities. Morris and the Anglins took advantage of these opportunities to gain access to materials and tools. Morris worked in the prison's brush factory, where inmates manufactured brushes and mops. This gave him access to various materials that could be repurposed. The Anglins worked in the prison's clothing and dry cleaning facility. Allen West, the fourth conspirator, worked as a painter and maintenance worker, which proved particularly valuable because it gave him legitimate reasons to be in different areas of the prison and to possess certain tools.
Over the course of many months, the men carefully collected and concealed various items. They obtained spoons from the dining hall, which they sharpened into makeshift chisels. They acquired a small drill motor from a vacuum cleaner that had been discarded or was being repaired. They fashioned drill bits from any metal they could find. They took small pieces of wood, metal, and other materials that could be used to create tools or to build other necessary items for their escape. Every item had to be stolen discreetly, and every tool had to be hidden carefully. The men concealed their contraband in the narrow spaces within their cells, behind pipes, under their bunks, anywhere that guards would not typically inspect during routine searches. The actual work of digging through the concrete around the ventilation grates had to be done with extraordinary caution. The men could only work during certain hours when the noise they made would be masked by other sounds in the prison. Music hour became their primary working time. Each evening, inmates were allowed a recreational period during which they could play musical instruments, listen to the radio, or engage in other activities. The cell block would fill with the sounds of accordions, guitars, harmonicas, and radios playing. Under this cover of noise, Morris and the Anglins would crouch at the back of their cells and carefully chip away at the concrete around their ventilation grates. They worked in near darkness, using improvised tools, making painstakingly slow progress. Each night, they would remove small amounts of concrete, being careful not to create too much dust or debris that might be noticed by guards during morning inspections. To conceal their work during the day, the men created false fronts for their ventilation grates. They used cardboard, painted to match the color of the concrete walls and the metal grates. These false fronts were so convincing that guards walking past the cells during routine inspections never noticed that the grates had been tampered with. This deception required artistic skill and attention to detail, and the men spent considerable time perfecting their camouflage. They mixed paint from whatever materials they could find, matching it precisely to the faded green and gray colors of the prison walls. They cut the cardboard to fit exactly into the spaces they were excavating, so that even from close inspection it appeared that nothing had been disturbed.
As the months passed and the holes behind their ventilation grates grew larger, the men began to focus on the next phase of their plan. Even if they successfully escaped from their cells and reached the utility corridor, they would still need to get out of the prison building itself and then off the island. The utility corridor led to the top of the cell block, where there was an air vent that opened onto the roof. This vent was covered by a metal grate, but it was less secure than the cell bars and could potentially be removed or forced open. Once on the roof, the men would need to climb down the building's exterior to reach the ground level, then make their way to the shore. This part of the plan carried enormous risk because the prison was equipped with guard towers, searchlights, and regular patrols. If they were spotted at any point during this phase of the escape, they would be caught immediately and likely shot. But the most daunting challenge of all was the water itself. Even if they reached the shore, they would still be on an island, surrounded by over a mile of frigid, turbulent water. Swimming to the mainland was virtually impossible. The currents in San Francisco Bay are notoriously treacherous, created by the meeting of the Pacific Ocean and the bay waters, intensified by tides that could reach speeds of 6 knots or more. Hypothermia would set in within 15 to 20 minutes. Without some form of flotation device or raft, drowning was almost certain. The prison administrators knew this, which is why they believed Alcatraz was escape-proof. But Morris and the Anglins had a plan for this as well. The men decided they would build a raft and life vests from raincoats. This idea might sound absurd, but it demonstrated the ingenuity and resourcefulness that characterized their entire escape plan. Raincoats were issued to inmates for outdoor work details, and they were made from a rubberized or treated fabric that was waterproof. The men realized that if they could acquire enough raincoats and seal them properly, they could create flotation devices that would keep them above water and protect them from the worst of the cold. But acquiring enough raincoats without arousing suspicion was another challenge entirely. The men couldn't simply steal dozens of raincoats. That would be noticed immediately. Instead, they had to be more subtle. They stole raincoats 1 or 2 at a time over many months, taking them from storage areas, from other inmates who weren't watching their belongings carefully, or from laundry facilities. Alan West's job as a maintenance worker proved particularly useful here, as he had access to storage areas that other inmates did not. Once they had collected enough raincoats, the men needed to construct their raft and life vests, and they needed to do this work secretly within their cells or in the utility corridor. They cut the raincoats into sections and used a makeshift glue or cement to seal the seams, creating airtight compartments that could be inflated.
The adhesive they used was likely made from a combination of materials they could obtain in the prison, possibly including soap, cement, or other binding agents. They created a system for inflating the raft using a crude bellows or pump fashioned from various materials. The construction of this raft required hours upon hours of meticulous work, all done in secret, all done with the knowledge that if they were discovered at any point, the entire plan would collapse. Perhaps the most famous aspect of the escape plan was the creation of the dummy heads. The men knew that guards conducted regular counts throughout the night, shining flashlights into cells to ensure inmates were in their bunks. If the men escaped from their cells but left their bunks empty, the alarm would be raised within hours, long before they could hope to get off the island and across the bay. They needed to buy time, to make the guards believe they were still in their cells sleeping peacefully while they were actually making their escape. The solution was to create fake heads that could be placed in their bunks, positioned on pillows to look like sleeping inmates in the dim light of the cell block at night. The dummy heads were crafted with remarkable skill and attention to detail. The men used a mixture of soap, toilet paper, and concrete powder to form the basic shape of a human head. They sculpted facial features, trying to create rough likenesses of themselves. They embedded real human hair into the heads, hair that they had collected from the prison barber shop over many weeks. Some of the hair came from the barber shop floor, swept up and smuggled back to the cells. Some may have come from their own heads, carefully saved from haircuts. They painted the heads using whatever materials they could find to approximate skin tones. The results were crude but effective. In the darkness of the cell block at night, with only a guard's flashlight providing brief illumination, these dummy heads would pass for sleeping men, at least for long enough to give the escapees a head start. By early June 1962, after more than 6 months of careful preparation, everything was ready. The holes behind the ventilation grates were large enough for the men to squeeze through. The raft and life vests were constructed and hidden in the utility corridor. The dummy heads were complete. The men had studied the guards' schedules and knew the optimal time to make their move. They had observed the tides and currents in the bay, and while they couldn't predict them perfectly, they had a sense of when conditions might be most favorable. They had even created crude makeshift paddles from wood to help them navigate in the water. Every detail had been planned, every contingency considered as much as possible. The time had come. The night chosen for the escape was June 11th, 1962. The men went through their normal evening routine, giving no indication that anything unusual was about to occur. After lights out at 9:30, the cell block grew quiet, except for the usual sounds of inmates settling in for the night, coughing, turning in their bunks, the occasional whispered conversation. Guards made their rounds, checking cells, seeing nothing out of the ordinary. The dummy heads were in place, looking like sleeping men in the darkness. Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin waited in their cells, listening to the sounds of the prison, waiting for the right moment. Alan West was prepared to join them, but he encountered a problem. The concrete around his ventilation grate, despite months of work, had not been fully removed. He continued to chip away at it frantically, quietly, trying to create an opening large enough to squeeze through. But time was working against him. Shortly after the evening count, Morris gave the signal, and the escape began. He quietly placed his dummy head on his pillow, arranging his blanket to create the silhouette of a sleeping man. Then he went to the back of his cell, removed the false cardboard front from his ventilation grate, and squeezed through the opening he had spent months creating. The hole was barely large enough, and he had to contort his body, scraping against the rough concrete edges, but he made it through. On the other side, he found himself in the utility corridor, a dark, narrow space filled with pipes and conduits, but it was freedom of a sort, the first step toward real freedom. John and Clarence Anglin followed the same process in their cells, each man placing his dummy head, squeezing through the ventilation hole, emerging into the utility corridor. They moved as quietly as possible, communicating in whispers, hearts pounding with adrenaline and fear. Alan West, however, was still struggling in his cell. The concrete around his ventilation grate remained too thick, too strong. He chipped and pried desperately, but he couldn't break through in time. The other 3 men waited for him as long as they dared, but they couldn't wait forever. Every minute they delayed increased the risk that a guard would discover them or that something would go wrong. Finally, with great reluctance, they made the decision to go on without West. It was a devastating moment for all of them, but they had no choice. West would have to remain behind, and the 3 of them would continue alone.
Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin made their way through the utility corridor to the top of the cell block. They climbed pipes and used ventilation shafts to ascend to the roof access point. When they reached the air vent that led to the roof, they found that its grate could be removed with some effort. They emerged onto the roof of the prison building into the cool night air. For the first time in years, they were outside, under the open sky, breathing air that didn't taste of concrete and metal. But they were far from free. They could hear the sounds of the prison around them, guards in their towers, the occasional shout or call. Searchlights swept across parts of the island periodically. They had to move carefully, staying low, staying in shadows. The men climbed down the exterior of the building, using pipes and the building's architectural features as handholds. It was dangerous work. One slip would mean a fatal fall or immediate capture, but they made it to the ground. From there, they moved toward the northeast shore of the island, staying out of sight as much as possible, moving during gaps between searchlight sweeps. They carried their raft and life vests with them, awkward burdens that they had to drag and carry quietly through the darkness. When they finally reached the rocky shore, they prepared their raft, inflating it using their makeshift pump, putting on their life vests. The water before them was black and forbidding, the lights of San Francisco visible in the distance, but seeming impossibly far away. The current was strong. They could feel it pulling at the water's edge. But they had come too far to turn back now.
Back in the prison, the night passed without incident. Guards made their rounds, shining flashlights into cells, seeing the dummy heads on the pillows and assuming all was well. It wasn't until the morning count, shortly after 7 in the morning on June 12th, that the escape was discovered. A guard noticed something odd about one of the figures in a cell. He looked more closely and realized he was staring at a fake head made of soap and paper. The alarm was raised immediately. Guards rushed through the cell block, checking cells, and quickly discovered that Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin were gone. The ventilation grates had been removed, the holes in the concrete exposed. The dummy heads sat on the pillows, crude but effective. The authorities were stunned. The prison that was supposed to be escape-proof had been breached. A massive manhunt began immediately. The FBI was called in. The Coast Guard launched boats to search the bay. Police departments throughout the Bay Area were alerted. Helicopters flew over the water and the surrounding islands. Divers searched the waters around Alcatraz. Every possible landing point on the mainland was watched. Roadblocks were set up. The story made national headlines. 3 inmates had escaped from Alcatraz, something that was supposed to be impossible, and now they were somewhere out there, perhaps alive, perhaps drowned in the bay. In the days following the escape, some evidence was found that suggested the men had made it into the water, but perhaps not much further. A paddle fashioned from wood was found floating in the bay. Pieces of raincoat material were discovered near Angel Island, about 2 miles north of Alcatraz. A wallet wrapped in plastic and containing photographs and addresses belonging to the Anglin family washed up on a beach. But there was debate about whether this had been placed there deliberately or had actually floated there from the escape. No bodies were found, which was both hopeful and ominous. Bodies of drowning victims in San Francisco Bay typically surfaced within a few days, as decomposition gases caused them to float. The fact that no bodies appeared suggested either that the men had survived or that their bodies had been swept out to sea through the Golden Gate and into the Pacific Ocean, where they might never be recovered. Allen West, who had been left behind in his cell, was interrogated extensively by the FBI and prison authorities. He provided detailed information about the escape plan, confirming the months of preparation, the tools they had used, the construction of the raft and life vests, and the intended escape route. West's information allowed investigators to understand how the escape had been accomplished, but it didn't help them find the escapees.
The FBI investigation was exhaustive. Agents interviewed family members and known associates of Morris and the Anglins. They followed up on reported sightings from around the country. Every few weeks or months, someone would claim to have seen one of the men, and agents would investigate, but none of these leads panned out. The Anglin family maintained that they had no knowledge of the brothers' whereabouts, though they also expressed hope that John and Clarence had survived. There were whispered rumors within the family that the brothers had made contact, that they were alive and living somewhere, but nothing was ever proven. As years passed without any confirmed sightings or credible evidence of the men's survival, the official position gradually solidified. Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin had most likely drowned in San Francisco Bay on the night of June 11th into June 12th, 1962. The FBI closed its active investigation in 1979, 17 years after the escape, concluding that the men were almost certainly dead. The U.S. Marshals Service, however, kept the case open, maintaining that until bodies were found or the men were proven deceased, they remained wanted fugitives. To this day, the Marshals Service continues to investigate any credible leads regarding the whereabouts of the escapees. But questions and mysteries have persisted for decades. Did they survive? Could they have made it across that frigid, treacherous water? Some experts believe it was possible. The distance from Alcatraz to the shore is about 1.5 miles, depending on the landing point. If the men had timed their escape to coincide with an outgoing tide that then turned to an incoming tide, the current might have actually helped carry them toward the shore rather than out to sea. If their raft held together, if they managed to stay afloat and avoid hypothermia long enough, they could have made it. The Anglin brothers were experienced swimmers, having grown up swimming in lakes and rivers. Frank Morris was intelligent and resourceful. It's not impossible that they succeeded. Over the years, various pieces of potential evidence have emerged that suggest the men might have survived. In the 1970s, a friend of the Anglin family claimed that he had received a Christmas card signed by John and Clarence in 1962, just months after the escape.
The handwriting was allegedly analyzed and found to be consistent with the brothers' writing, but this evidence was never conclusive. Family members of the Anglins have said that for years after the escape, the family would receive mysterious flowers on their mother's birthday, with no card or indication of who sent them, leading them to believe the brothers were alive and staying in touch subtly.
In 2013, a letter surfaced that reignited interest in the case and debate about whether the men survived. The letter, written in 2013, was reportedly sent to the San Francisco Police Department and claimed to be from John Anglin. In the letter, the writer stated that he was 83 years old, that he had escaped from Alcatraz in 1962, and that Frank Morris had died in 2008, and his brother Clarence had died in 2011. The writer claimed that all three men had survived the escape and had lived free lives for decades. He said he was now suffering from cancer and proposed turning himself in exchange for medical treatment. The letter included specific details about the escape and about John Anglin's life, and the handwriting bore some resemblance to known samples of Anglin's writing from the 1960s. However, the FBI's analysis of the letter was inconclusive. They could not definitively prove the letter was genuine, nor could they definitively prove it was a hoax. The person who wrote the letter never came forward, never turned himself in, and the letter remains an intriguing but unverified piece of the puzzle. There have been other tantalizing hints over the years. In 2015, a History Channel documentary presented a photograph that the Anglin family claimed showed John and Clarence in Brazil in 1975, 13 years after the escape. The photograph showed two men standing next to a termite mound, and facial recognition experts analyzed the image, concluding that there was a significant likelihood that the men in the photo were indeed John and Clarence Anglin. The Anglin family also presented other evidence, suggesting that the brothers had contacts in South America and might have fled there after the escape. However, like so much of the evidence in this case, nothing could be proven conclusively. The enduring mystery of the Alcatraz escape has made it one of the most famous unsolved cases in American history. It captured the public's imagination because it represented something almost mythical, the idea that three men with determination, intelligence, and courage could defeat a system designed to be unbeatable. Alcatraz stood as a symbol of the government's power, the ultimate prison from which no one could escape. The fact that Morris and the Anglins might have proven that assumption wrong, that they might have outsmarted the guards and the walls and the water itself, turned them into folk heroes of a sort, regardless of their crimes.
The escape also had practical consequences. It exposed serious security flaws at Alcatraz and contributed to the decision to close the prison permanently in 1963, just 1 year after the escape. The cost of maintaining the aging facility, combined with the embarrassment of the escape, made it clear that Alcatraz's time had passed. Today, the island is a popular tourist destination, and visitors can see the cells that Morris and the Anglins escaped from, with the dummy heads still displayed, the holes in the walls preserved as they were found. The story of the escape is told and retold to millions of visitors who walk through those cell blocks, trying to imagine what it must have been like to plan and execute such an audacious breakout. Whether Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin died in the cold waters of San Francisco Bay that night in June 1962, or whether they somehow survived and lived out their lives in freedom, remains unknown. The official conclusion is that they drowned,
that the bay claimed them as it was always supposed to. But the lack of bodies, the various pieces of evidence suggesting survival, and the persistent rumors and alleged sightings have kept the possibility alive that they made it, that they beat the odds and escaped to live another day. The truth, whatever it may be, rests with those three men, and with the water and the night that swallowed them up more than 60 years ago. And perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Some stories are meant to have ambiguous endings, and the escape from Alcatraz will forever stand as a testament to human ingenuity, determination, and the eternal desire for freedom.